Hey everyone, it's your host Ruby, and welcome back to Strange Minds 6. Today, we are going to read Chapter 10 from The Darkest Minds by Alexandra Bracken. Now, without further ado, please get your snacks, get your drink, sit back and relax, and if you can, please hit that thumbs up button, and if you're not already, please subscribe. We would greatly appreciate it. Now, let's get to it, shall we? Chapter 10. Chubbs was the one to wake me. It was a quick slap to my shoulder, like he couldn't bring himself to touch it long enough to put the effort into shaking me, but it was enough. I had been curled like a shrimp on one of the cramped seats, but at his touch, I bolted out of it, knocking my head against the window. I felt its cold touch on the back of my neck as I all but tumbled in the narrow space between the front seat and mine. For a single foggy instant, I couldn't remember where I was, never mind how I had gotten there. Chubbs' face crossed back into my line of sight, one eyebrow arched at my single tangled limbs. And then it all came back to me, like a punch to the throat. Damn it, damn it, damn it, I thought, trying to smooth my dark hair out of my face. I had only meant to rest my eyes for a few minutes, and who knows how long I'd been conked out. Judging by Chubbs' expression, it hadn't been a short nap. "Don't you think you slept long enough?" he huffed, crossing his arms over his chest. The van felt warmer, and I didn't realize why until I sat up and saw the dark blue fabric that had been strung up to cover the rear windshield. The reality of the situation struck me at once. With a sharp twist in my side, I left myself wide open in a van of strangers, so wide open, in fact, that Chubbs had been able to put a hand on me. God, I didn't know which of us had come out luckier in the end. Him for not having his brain wiped clean, or me for avoiding yet another potential disaster. How stupid could I be? The second they knew what I was, they'd throw me out. And then, where would I be? Speaking of which, where are we? I pulled myself back up into the seat. Where are the others? Chubbs sat in one of the middle seats, dividing his time between the book in his lap and the world of trees just outside the tinted car window. I moved, trying to follow his gaze, but there was nothing to see. "Somewhere near the lovely city of Kingwood, West Virginia. Lee and Suzumi are checking something out," he said. I had leaned forward without realizing it, trying to see what he was reading. It'd been a year since I'd even seen a book, let alone read from one. Chubbs wasn't having it, though. The moment my shoulder brushed his, he snapped the book shut and turned to give me the nastiest stink eye he could muster. Even with his two small glasses, and my knowledge of his little fancy lady kit under the front seat, I reminded myself there was a distinct possibility he was capable of killing me with his brain. How long did I sleep? A day, Chubbs said. The general wants you up and ready to report to duty. He's in one of his go, go, go moods. You may only be a green, but he's expecting you to help. I chose my next words carefully, ignoring the smug look on his face. Let him think that if it made him feel better. He was smarter. There was no debate about that. He probably had years of education on me, had read hundreds more books, and could remember enough math to actually be useful. But as small and stupid as he made me feel, there was no ignoring the fact that all it would take is one touch, and I could have read him the contents of his brain. Liam's a blue, right? I began. Are you and Zoo both blue too? No. He frowned. And it took him several moments to decide whether or not to reveal his next bit of information. Suzumi's yellow. I sat up a little straighter. You had yellow camps at your camp? Chubbs grunted. No, Green. I just lied to you. Yes, we had yellows. That didn't make sense. After all, if they took the yellows out of Thurman, why wouldn't they have taken them from all the camps? I began, unsure of how to ask this, when she first pulled me into the van. I thought she was just shy and skittish around strangers, but I hadn't heard her utter a single word in the entire time I had been with them. Not to me, not to Chubbs, not even to Liam. Did they do something to the yellows? To her? The only way the van's atmosphere could have been electrified faster was if I had thrown a live wire into a full bathtub. Chubbs turned toward me sharply, drawing his arms up, crossing them in front of his chest. The look he leveled at me over his glasses would have turned a weaker soul to stone. That, he said slowly, precisely, I thought, to make sure I understood, is absolutely none of your business. I held up my hands, retreating. Were you even thinking about what could happen to her when you followed her? He pressed on. Do you even care that your friends in the green SUV would have gladly scooped her up? The people in the green SUV? I began, and would have finished had the door not suddenly rolled open behind us. Chubbs let out a noise that could only be described as a squawk, and just about flew into the front passenger seat. By the time he had settled himself down, his eyes were almost as wide as Zoo's, who stood watching him from the door. "Don't do that," he gasped, clutching his chest. "Give us a little warning, will you?" Zhu raised an eyebrow in my direction, and I raised one right back at her. After a moment, she seemed to remember the reason she had come and began waving us outside, her bright sunny colored gloves flashing. Chubbs unbuckled his seat belt with an aggravated sigh. I told him this was a waste of time. They said Virginia, not West Virginia. He turned his gaze back toward me. By the way, he added, that SUV was tan. That's some photographic memory you have. An excuse leaped to my throat, but he cut me off with a knowing look and slammed the door behind him. I jumped out of the van and followed Zhu. As my feet sunk into the mud and sad yellowed green grass, I had my first good look around. A large wooden sign, leaning back like someone had nearly run it over, said East River Camping Grounds, but there was no river, and it certainly wasn't your typical camping ground. If anything, it was, or once was, an old trailer and RV park. The farther we walked from the minivan, the more nervous I felt. It wasn't raining, but my skin felt clammy and cold to the touch. All around us, as far as my eyes could tell, were the burnt-out silver and white husks of former homes and vehicles. Several of the larger, more permanent trailers had entire walls ripped or charred away, revealing kitchens and living rooms with their insides still intact, if not waterlogged and infested with animals and slowly rotten leaves from the nearby trees. It was like a massive grave of past lives. Even though screen doors had been ripped off or warped, even though some RVs knelt on whatever tires had been slashed, there were still signs of life all around. Walls were decorated with pictures of happy and smiling families. A grandfather clock was still counting time. Pots were still on stoves. A small swing set remained undisturbed and lonely on the far end of the grounds. Zhu and I navigated around an RV that was now on its side, following a path of deep footsteps in the mud. I took one look at the RV's rusted bones and immediately turned away, my hand tightening around Zhu's glove. She looked up at me with a questioning look, but I only shook my head and said, "Spooky." When the rain came, it hammered against the metal bodies around us, rattling a few of the weaker roofs and screens. I jumped back with a yelp when a trailer's door fell into our path. Zhu only jumped over it and pointed ahead to where Chubbs and Liam were locked in conversation. It had taken me a second to recognize Liam under his jacket. He wore a blue sweatshirt with the hoodie pulled up over what looked like a Redskins hat. I had no idea where he managed to find them, but a pair of aviator glasses obscured a good portion of his face from view. "Isn't it?" Chubbs said. "I told you." "They said it was at the east edge of the state," Liam insisted. "And they could have meant West Virginia. Or they could have been screwing with us." Chubbs finished for him. He must have heard us approaching, because he jumped and turned around. The moment he locked eyes with me, he scowled. "Morning, sunshine," Liam called. "Sleep okay?" Zoo darted out ahead of me, but I could feel my feet begin to drag with an invisible weight as I came toward them. I crossed my arms over my chest, steadying myself enough to ask, "What is this place?" This time it was Liam who blew out a sigh. "Well, we were hoping it was East River. The East River, I mean." "That's in Virginia," I said, looking down at my shoes. "The peninsula. It empties into the Chesapeake Bay." "Thank you, Detective Duh." Chubbs shook his head. "We're talking about the Slip Kids River. The Slip Kids East River." "Hey." Liam's voice was sharp. "Lay off, buddy. We really didn't know anything about it until we were out of camp either." Chubbs crossed his arms over his chest and looked away. "Whatever." "What is it?" I felt Liam turn his attention back to me, which immediately prompted me to turn my attention back to Zoo, who mostly just looked confused. "Get a grip," I ordered myself. "Stop it." I wasn't afraid of them, not even Chubbs. Maybe a bit when I thought too hard about how easily I could ruin their lives, or pictured their horrified reactions if they were to figure out what exactly I was. I just didn't know what to say or how to act around them. Every moment and word on my part felt uncomfortable, shrill, or sharp, and I was beginning to worry that the feelings of hesitancy and awkwardness were never going to lift. I already felt like the freak of freaks, without the added realization that I lacked the basic ability of communicating normally with other human beings. Liam sighed, scratching the back of his head. "We first heard about the East River from some kids in our camp. Supposedly, and I mean supposedly, it's a place where any kids on the outside can go and live together. The Slip Kid who runs the show can get you in touch with your folks without the PSFs finding out about it. There's food, a place to sleep. Well, you get the picture. The problem is finding it. We think it's somewhere in this area, thanks to a few fairly unhelpful blues we ran across in Ohio. It's the kind of thing that if you're in the know, you're not supposed to talk about it," I finished. "But who's the Slip Kid?" Liam shrugged. No one knows, or, well, I guess people know. They just don't say. The rumors about him are pretty incredible, though. The PSFs gave him that nickname because he supposedly escaped their custody a good 4 times. I was too stunned to say anything to that. Kinda puts the rest of us to shame, huh? I was feeling really bad about myself until someone told me the rumors about him. Liam shuddered. Supposedly, he's one of those, in orange. That single word thundered down around me, freezing in place. Liam went on to say something else with a lot less disgust, but I couldn't hear him over the roar in my ears. I didn't hear a word of what he was saying. Slip kid. Someone who could help kids get home, if they had a home to return to, and parents who remembered them and wanted them, a life to reclaim, and potentially one of the last orange kids out there. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them for a good measure. I didn't qualify for his help, not in the traditional way. Even if I could get in touch with my parents, it wasn't like they would welcome a girl they considered a stranger back with open arms. There was Grams, but I had no way of knowing where she was now. After finding out what I had done, would she even want me? Why do you even need this guy's help? I interrupted, still feeling lightheaded. Can't you just go home? Use your brain, Green, Chubbs said. We can't go home because PSFs are probably watching our parents. Liam shook his head, finally taking his sunglasses off. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes baggy and bruised. You'll have to be really careful, okay? Do you even want me to drop you off at that bus station? Because we'd be happy. No, Chubb said. We most certainly would not. We've already wasted enough time on her, and she's the reason we have the League after us too. A sharp pain sprouted on the left side of my chest, just above my heart. He was right, of course. The best option for everyone would be to drop me off at the nearest bus station and be done with it. But it didn't mean I didn't want to or need to find this slip kid as badly as they did, but I couldn't ask to stay. I couldn't impose on them any more than I already had, or risk ruining them with the invisible fingers. That seemed bent on tearing apart every single connection I managed to make. If the League caught up to us and took them in, I'd never forgive myself. Never. If I was going to find the slip kid, I was going to have to do it by myself. You'd think I'd be used to the thought of taking on each day with no one by my side. That it'd be some kind of relief not to be in constant danger of sliding into someone else's head, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to step out under the gray, overcast sky alone and feel its chill work its way under my skin. So, I said, squinting at the nearest trailer, this isn't East River. It might have been, once, Liam said. They could move around from time to time. I hadn't really considered it. Or, Chubbs groused, they could have already been taken back into PSF custody. Maybe this was East River, and now there is no more East River, and we're going to have to find a way to deliver Jack's letter and get home by ourselves. Only we won't ever because of the skip tracers, and we'll all be thrown back into camp. Only this time they'll thank you, Chuckles, Liam cut in, for the rousing burst of optimism. I could be right, he said. You have to acknowledge that. But you could also be wrong, Liam said, dropping a reassuring hand on Zoo's head. In any case, that's what we're going with now. This was just a false alarm. Let's see if we can find anything useful, then we'll hit the road. Finally, I'm sick of wasting time on things that don't matter. Chubbs shoved his hands into his trouser pockets and stalked toward me. If I hadn't jumped out of the way, his shoulder would have knocked into mine and sent me stumbling back. I turned, my eyes following his path as he kicked rubbish and rocks out of his way. Liam was suddenly standing next to me, his own arms crossed over his chest. Don't take it personally, he said. I must have made a sound of disbelief because he continued. I mean, okay, the kid is basically a grumpy 70-year-old man trapped in a 17-year-old body. But he's only being this insufferable to try to push you out. Yeah, well, I thought, it's working. And I know it's not an excuse, but he's as stressed and freaked out as the rest of us. I guess what I'm trying to say is, all of this acid he's throwing your way, it's coming from a good place. If you stick it out, I swear, you won't find a more loyal friend. But he's scared as hell about what'll happen, especially to Zoo, if we're caught again. I looked up at that, but Liam was already walking away toward a far row of battered trailers. For one crazy second, I thought about following him, but I'd caught Zoo at the corner of my eyes, her bright yellow gloves swinging at her sides. She jumped in and out of the trailers, stood on her toes to peer into the smashed windows of the RVs, and even at one point started to crawl into wreckage of an RV that looked like it had been split in half by a tornado. The metal roof, which was hanging on by what looked like two flimsy joints, was swaying and bouncing under the combined forces of rain and wind. Although she had the hood of an oversized sweatshirt pulled snug over her head, I watched as one of Zoo's gloved hands came up and brushed the side of her face, as if She was pushing a strand out of her eyes. It didn't strike me as strange until she did it again, only to pale slightly as she caught herself. The conversation I had tried to have with Chubbs in the van came crashing back to me. "Hey, Zoo," I began, only to stop short. How are you supposed to ask a little kid if someone had played slice and dice with her brain without trampling over an already painful memory? The truth of it was, they only shaved kids' heads at Thurman when they wanted to do some poking around inside of their skulls. They had all but stopped by the time I arrived, but it had taken a while for the older kids' hair to grow back out. Some were in the back of my mind. I had wondered if this wasn't the case with her after all. Sorry about that. Now, back to the story. If the reason she couldn't speak was because they had crossed a few wires they shouldn't have, or gone a step too far in the name of finding a so-called cure, why did they cut your hair? I asked finally. I knew plenty of girls that would have preferred shorter hair, myself included, but aside from an annual haircut for the girls, we didn't have much say in the matter. The way that Zoo seemed to stroke her ghost hair made me think she hadn't much say either. If she had been upset by my question, she didn't show it. Zoo brought her hands up to her head and began to scrub at it, making a face of an acute discomfort. Seeing that I wasn't getting it, she slipped one hand out of its glove and went to work scratching the scalp of her head. "Oh," I said. "Oh, you mean your group had lice?" She nodded. "Yikes," I said. It made sense, but it still didn't explain why she couldn't open her mouth and answer me. "I'm so sorry." Zoo lifted a shoulder in a half-hearted shrug, then turned and bounded up into the nearest RV. The door wobbled and protested as I followed her in, squealing as its hinges worked. Zoo made a face, and I made one back at her in agreement. The whole home smelled sweet, but not pleasant, almost like rotten fruit. I started in the small central living space, opening and closing the pale cabinet doors. The seat cushions were done up in an obnoxiously bright purple, but they, like the small TV hanging on the wall across from them, were coated with dust and dirt. The only thing out on the counter was a single coffee mug. The back sleeping area was equally spare. A few cushions, a lamp, and a closet with a red dress, a white button-down shirt, and a whole fleet of empty hangers. I had only just reached for the shirt when I saw it at the edge of my vision. Someone had attached it to the RV's windshield in place of a rearview mirror. It was nothing that would have seemed odd from the outside looking in or drawn attention unless you were really truly staring at it. But inside, standing only a few feet away from it, I was close enough to see the red light at the base of it, close enough to see that camera inside was pointed toward everything and everyone that passed on by the road in front of it. And if I could see Betty from where I was, so could it. The camera's shape was slightly different from the ones they had at Thurman, but close enough to make me think the same people were behind it. I looked down at Zoo, and she looked up at me. "Stay right here," I said, reaching for the coffee pot on the table. I crossed the RV in 3 steps, the coffee pot out in front of me like a sword. I kicked aside a few empty boxes and trash and saw, mixed in with the litter of plastic bags, a small red glove, too small for an adult's hand. I didn't realize the pot was still in my hands until I brought it down against the device and smashed it. The cheap glass body broke off and fell to the ground, leaving me holding its handle. The black bulb stayed perched exactly where it was, only now the camera's eye rotated to my face. It's on, I thought, through the haze of panic, searching for something else to smash it with. It's recording. I didn't remember calling for her. But Zoo appeared at my side in an instant, stuffing something under the front of her oversized shirt. She must have recognized it too, because before I could even get another word in, she was pulling off one of her yellow rubber gloves and reaching toward it. "Don't!" I'd never seen a yellow use their abilities before. I'd suffered the after effects, of course. Power outages across the camp, white noise when the camp controllers thought one of them had done it on purpose. But they had been gone so long at Thurman that I had stopped trying to imagine what it must have been like for them to speak the mysterious language of electricity. Zoo's fingers had only brushed against it, but the camera began to let out a high-pitched whine. There was a bolt of white-blue that seemed to leap from her bare finger at the camera's outer shell. That same crackling line whipped down over the plastic, causing it to smoke and warp under its heat. Without warning, all of the lights in the RV flashed on, glowing so molten hot that they shattered. The vehicle began to cough and sputter, shaking under our feet as its engine found itself miraculously revived after a long sleep. Zoo jammed her hand back into its glove and crossed her arms over her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if willingly it all to stop. But we didn't have time to wait around and see if it would. I moved toward the door, grabbing the front of her sweatshirt to all but drag her out of the RV. She was still stumbling as I pulled her around the end that faced the road and Black Betty. "Come on," I said, not letting her slow. The brightness was gone from her face, blown out like a candle. "It's okay," I lied. "We just need to get the others." There was a camera installed in the front windshield of every trailer in the front row. I spotted them one by one as we ran back toward Betty. There was no point trying to get rid of them now. Whoever was going to see us had likely already seen us. We just had to get out of there, and fast. They could be old, I tried telling myself, throwing Betty's door open. They could have been installed years ago in case of robberies. Who knew where the video they recorded was being sent? Maybe nowhere at all. And at that time, my heart was beating out a completely different track. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming. I thought about yelling for the others, but they would have been anywhere. They could have been anywhere in the park. I climbed into the van after Zoo and did the only other thing that seemed to make sense in that moment. I banged the heel of my palm against the wheel. The high whine of Betty's horn shook the sleepy landscape awake. A cluster of birds flew up the nearby tree, hitting the sky at the same moment. I began beating out a faster, more insistent rhythm. Chubbs appeared first, booking it down one aisle of RVs, and Liam a second later, a few rows over. When they saw that it was still us, they both slowed down. An annoying look crossed Chubbs' face. I leaned out of the driver's window and shouted, "We have to go, now!" Liam said something to Chubbs that I didn't hear, but they did as they were told. I stayed crouched between the two front seats as the boys jumped inside. "What?" Liam was almost out of breath. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the nearest trailer. "They have cameras installed," my voice rasped. "In every one of them." Chubbs sucked in a sharp breath. "You're sure?" Liam's voice was calm, too calm. I could tell he was forcing it, even as his fingers fumbled to put the keys in the ignition. The van's back tires spun against the mud as he threw it into reverse. I went tumbling on my backside with the force of his acceleration. "Oh my God," Chubbs was saying. "I can't believe it. We got Hansel and Gretel'd." "Oh my God, do you think it was her?" "No," Liam said. "No. She's sneaky for a skip tracer. But this is something else." "They could have been there for a while," I said. Just as we found the highway again, it was empty and open in front of us. A gaping mouth ready to swallow us whole. They could have been spying on the people that live there. Maybe that really was East River. Or it was just a trap for kids looking for the real East River. Liam propped his elbow against the door panel and his chin against his palm when he spoke. The hundreds of snaking cracks in the windshield caught up his reflection. He pushed the minivan up into a faster speed, causing the wind to whistle through the bullet hole. "Just keep your eyes open and let me know if you see anyone or anything acting suspicious." Or anything acting suspect. Define suspect. The rows of shattered houses, a shot-up minivan. "I knew we should have waited until it was dark," Chubbs said, tapping his finger against the passenger seat window. "I knew it. If those cameras were on, they probably got the license plate and everything." "I'll take care of the plates," Liam promised. Chubbs' lips parted, but he said nothing, only resting his head against the window. "Should I be looking for PSFs?" I asked as we drove over another railroad track. "Worse," Chubb sighed. "Skip tracers, bounty hunters. The PSFs are stretched very, very thin by all accounts. Liam explained. Some of the National Guard and what's left of the local police. I don't know that they'd send a unit all the way out here on a tip. And unless they just so happen to have a resident bounty hunter in this neck of the woods, we're going to be fine. Those were famous last words if I had ever heard them. The reward for turning in a kid is $10,000. Chubbs twisted around to look at me. And the whole country is broke as a joke. We are not going to be fine. I heard a train in the distance, its horn so similar to the ones that had passed by Thurman at all hours of the night. It was enough for me to dig my fingernails into the skin of my thighs and squeeze my eyes shut until the nausea passed. I didn't even realize the conversation had rolled on without me until I heard Liam ask, "You okay, Green?" I reached up and wiped my face, wondering if the wetness there was from the rain or if I had been crying without realizing it. I didn't say anything as I crawled to the rear seat. I didn't jump into the conversation about where they would need to look next for East River, though I wanted to. There were hundreds, thousands, millions of places the Slip Kid could have set up camp, and I wanted to help them puzzle it out. I wanted to be a part of it, but I couldn't ask, and I needed to stop lying to myself, because every second I stayed with them was another chance for them to discover that skip tracers and PSFs weren't the real monsters of the world. No, one of the real ones was sitting in their back seat. For once, the music was off. It was the silence from the speakers that unnerved me, more than the deserted roads or the empty shells of repossessed houses. Liam was a constant stream of motion. Looking around the abandoned small towns as we drove through, glancing at the gas level, fiddling with the turn signal, fingers dancing on the steering wheel. At one point his eyes flashed toward mine in the rearview mirror. It was just for an instant, but I felt the small twinge of my stomach as sharply as I would have if he had taken a soft finger and run it down the length of my open palm. My face was flushed, but something inside me had gone very cold. It had been half a second, no more, but it was plenty long enough to notice the way his eyes had darkened with something that might have been frustration. Chubbs was in the front seat, folding and unfolding something in his lap, over and over again, almost like he didn't realize he was doing it. "Will you cut that out?" Liam burst out, agitated. "You'll rip it." Chubbs stopped immediately. "Can't we just try? Do we need the Slip Kid for this? Do you really want to risk it? Jack would have... Right. But Jack..." Liam's voice trailed off. "Let's just play it safe. He'll help us when we get there. If we get there." Chubbs huffed. "Jack?" I didn't realize I had said it out loud until Liam's eyes looked back at me in the rearview mirror. "It's none of your business," Chubbs said, and left it at that. Liam was only a little more forthcoming. He was our friend. In our room at camp, I mean. We're just trying to get in touch with his dad. It's one of the reasons we need to hit up the Slip Kid." I nodded toward the sheet of paper. But before you guys broke out, he wrote a letter? The three of us each did, Liam said, in case one of us backed out at the last minute and didn't want to come or didn't make it out, which Jack did not. Chubbs' voice could have cut steel. Behind him, house after gorgeous colonial house passed in rapid-fire succession, their colors winking at us through her window. Anyway, Liam cleared his throat. We're trying to put his letter in his dad's hand. We tried going to the address Jack gave us, but the house had been repossessed. He left a note saying he was going to DC for work, but no new address or phone number. That's why we need the Skip Kids' help to find where he is now. You can't just mail it? They started scanning mail for this exact reason about 2 years after you went to Thurman, Liam explained. The government reads all, speaks all, and writes all. They have crafted a lovely little story about how we are all being saved and reprogrammed back into sweet little darlings at camp, and they don't want anyone to get wind of the truth. I honestly had no idea what to say to that. Sorry, I mumbled. I didn't mean to give you a shakedown about it. It's okay, Liam said, after the silence had stretched to the point of breaking. It's fine. There wasn't a way to explain how I knew. Maybe it was the way Liam's hands tightened on the steering wheel, or how he kept glancing in his side mirror throughout the conversation, long after a silver car had passed us from the other direction. It could have been the way his shoulders sagged, sloping down in a way that was so defeated. I just knew long before I caught his worried eyes in the rearview mirror. Slowly, without disturbing Zoo and Chubbs, as they watched an endless stream of forest pass by the side windows, I crouched between the two front seats again. Liam met my gaze for a split second, nodding in the direction of his side mirror. See for yourself, he seemed to say. So I did. Trailing behind us, back about 2 cars' length, was an old white pickup truck, with the rain fogging up the air between the 2 cars. I couldn't tell if there were 1 or 2 men inside. They looked like little more than 2 black ants from where I was sitting. Interesting, I said, keeping my voice even. Yep, he said, his jaw clenched, the muscles of his neck strained. Gotta love West Virginia. Glorious mountain state, land o' many John Denver songs. Maybe, I began slowly, you should pull over and look at the map. It was one way of feeling out of the situation. Liam was about to turn onto George Washington Highway, slightly wider than the road, than twisting road where we were leaving. If the truck was following us, they wouldn't be able to stop without revealing it. In any case, whoever was driving the truck wasn't being aggressive about it. If he was a bounty hunter, as Liam apparently thought, they were probably feeling us out too. We continued up Gorman Road, following its natural curve, Back, Black Betty slowed in anticipation of the upcoming turn. Liam hesitated half a second before flipping his turn signal on. I looked in the mirror. My heart lifted when I saw the truck turn its other blinker on. They were turning right. We were going left. Liam blew out a long sigh, finally sitting back against his seat as the minivan reached the intersection of the highway and the road. There was another car turning off the highway, a small silver Volkswagen. Both Liam and I threw up a hand to block the intense glint of the sun against its windows. "Okay, Old Man River." Liam gave the car an impatient wave. "Go ahead and turn before the next century. No, take your time. Shave, contemplate the universe." Leonard Skinnard was blasting through the pickup truck's open windows as it pulled up alongside of us, creaking and groaning in the way all old cars seem to do. Freebird, of course. It had to be my dad's favorite. 2 seconds into the damn song, and it was like I was back in the front seat of his squad car, cruising around town. That was the only time I got to listen to the good music, when it was just the two of us cruising. Mom hated the stuff. A laugh bubbled up inside me as I watched the driver bob his head in time with the music. He howled the words at the top of his lungs, exhaling each lyric with a puff of cigarette smoke. And then it was replaced by a different sound, a shriek of sorts. I looked up just in time to see the Volkswagen slam on its brakes right in front of us, jolting to a stop and sending another blinding glare of sunlight our way. "You have got to be kidding me," Liam made, as if to press his hand down on the horn, but not before the driver of the Volkswagen rolled down his window and pointed something black and gleaming at us. "No." The world went into sharp focus, sound evaporating around me. "No." I reached up and slapped Black Betty's radio on, turning it up as loud as it would go. Liam and Chubbs both started yelling, but I knocked Liam's hand away before he could switch it off. The white noise cut straight through the music from the speakers, tearing at our ears, not as loud or as powerful as I was used to, and not even close to as bad as it had been last time, but still, they're still agonizing. The radio trick couldn't drown it out. Not completely. The others crumbled around me, shriveling at the first piercing shriek. Liam fell forward against the wheel, mashing his hands up against his ears. Chubbs knocked his head into the passenger seat window, as if trying to ram the noise out of his head. I felt Black Betty began to drift forward, only to jerk to a stop when Liam hit the brakes instead of the gas. The door opened beside me, and a pair of arms circled Chubb's waist, trying to untangle him from the seatbelt. I'd pulled myself up the floor and lashed a hand out, catching the man's cheek and racking my fingernails down as hard as I could. It was enough to startle the truck driver. the same one that had been nodding his head to Freebird 2 seconds before into dropping Chubbs. He was left half hanging in his seat, half hanging out. The driver stumbled back against the bed of his truck, his words drowned out by the thunderstorm of noise that had settled over the 3 cars. It was only then that I saw the badge hanging around his neck on a silver cord and the bright red symbol stitched there. They weren't skip tracers. PSI, PSF, Camp Thurman Capture. The man from the Volkswagen had opened the driver's side door and of the van and was trying to unhook Liam's seatbelt. He wasn't large in any case of the word. He looked like he could have been an accountant with thick glasses and hunched shoulders from spending too many hours at the desk. But he didn't need strength, not when he was holding the black megaphone in his hands. Some of the PSFs at Thurman carry the noise machine with them, blasting them at small rowdy groups or just to see a few kids squirm. What did they care? They couldn't hear it. Every nerve in my body was singing, but I launched my elbow into the chest of the pickup driver's. He fell back again, and I pulled the door shut and locked it. I only had a second to look back at Zoo as I drove across Liam's body. Fist first, I nailed Volkswagen in the glasses, knocking them off his face. Somewhere behind me, pickup truck had moved onto the sliding door, and this time he wasn't empty-handed. Zoo flinched as the rifle was pointed towards her. By the way she was moaning, her eyes scrunched up and her yellow gloves curled over her ears in agony. I don't think she was seeing straight. I didn't know what to do. My hands were on Liam, trying to shake him back into consciousness. His eyes flashed open, clear and so blue, but it was only for an instant. The megaphone suddenly 2 inches away from me, and the white noise sunk into my brain like an axe. My bone went to jelly. I didn't recognize the fact I had fallen over until Liam was there. The only thing louder than the white noise, than the radio, than Chubb's scream was the sound of Liam's heart racing. I squeezed my eyes shut again, the fingers curling into soft leather of Liam's coat. Half of me wanted to push away, but enough distance between us that I had no chance of sliding into his mind. But the other half of me, the desperate part, was already trying to push through, to anchor myself to him and will him to move. If I hurt someone, shouldn't that mean I could help them too? Get up, I begged. Get up, get up, get up, get up. There was a high-pitched wail, a sound that couldn't have possibly come from a human. I forced my eyes to open. Pickup truck had his rifle in one hand and the collar of Zoo's shirt in the other, and he was tugging both in the direction of the truck. I tried to scream for her, even as I felt the Volkswagen hands on my hair yanking me up and out the door. He let me hit the ground hard. The loose gravel cut open my legs and palms. I rolled onto my side, trying to twist away from the PSF's reach. From under Betty, I saw flutters of yellow dropping to the road, the 2 small birds, and heard a door slam. Stewart, confirm, PSI number 42755, spotted. Volkswagen wrenched the driver's side door open again, pulling something bright orange from his pocket. I swiped at my eyes, trying to force the double image of him I was seeing back into one. The orange device in the PSF's free hand was no bigger than a cell phone, easy enough to maneuver in front of Liam's face from where it was pressed against the minivan steering wheel. Taking a swipe at the PSF's ankle with my hand was pointless. He was so involved with whatever he was doing that he didn't so much as notice. Liam! My mouth wasn't moving. It wasn't working. Liam! The orange device flashed, and a moment later, above even the wailing of the white noise, I heard Volkswagen say, "That's a positive ID on Liam Stewart." Something hot and sharp cut the air, billowing out under Betty like a stinging cloud of sand. I felt it rub up against my bare skin and had to turn my face away from the blinding light that came next, a flash burn that erased anything and everything that stood in its way. I heard Volkswagen cuss from above me, only to be drowned out by the sound of metal screeching against metal, glass exploding so hard, so fast, that tiny shards dropped like hail onto the ground in front of me. And then it was gone. The white noise cut out sharply as something clattered to the ground and landed a short distance away from the megaphone. I stretched my arm out, hand groping the megaphone's handle. Volkswagen was screaming something that I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears, and I was too focused on getting the bullhorn to actually give a damn and listen. A hand wrapped around my bare ankle and tugged me across the ground, but before my fingers closed around the handle, "Get up, you piece of..." There was a digital squeak, like an alarm, and the man immediately dropped my leg. "This is Larson, requesting immediate backup." I pushed myself up on my knees with a grunt, then my feet. The man had his back turned to me 1 second too long, and when he finally realized his mistake and looked over his shoulders, he was rewarded with a face full of metal as I swung the megaphone. His radio clattered to the asphalt, and I kicked it out of his reach. Both of his hands went up, trying to shield his face from another hit, but I wasn't going to go easy on him. I wasn't going to let him take me back to Thurman. My hand closed over his exposed forearm, and I yanked it, forcing him to look down on me. I watched his pupils shrink in his hazel eyes before blowing back out to their normal size. The man had a foot of height on me, but you never would have known by the way he dropped to his knees in front of me. He hadn't even been able to catch his breath, let alone keep me from walking straight into his mind. "Leave," I tried to say. My jaw was clenched, the muscles there seized as though the white noise was still running through them like a current of pulsating electricity. "Leave." I had never done this before, and there was no way to know if it would actually work. But what did I have to lose now? His memories flooded over me, wave after wave, lapping at my brain, and all I could think was, "I'm going to do this. It is going to work." Martin had said that he pushed feelings into people, but my abilities didn't work that way, and they never had. I only saw images. I could only muddle, sort, and erase images, but I never tried to do anything else. I had never wanted to before this moment, because if I couldn't help these kids, if I couldn't save them, then what good was I? What point did I even have? Do it. Just do it. I imagined the man picking up his radio, every detail from the way he would fumble for it without his glasses to the way his jeans would wrinkle. I imagined him canceling the request for backup. I imagined him walking down the rocky hill that kissed the edge of the road into the wild, and then I released my fingers from his arm. One by one, that's exactly what he did. He walked away, and each step brought a new jolt of shock. I had done that. Me. I turned to where black smoke spilled over the road, coating the hill's grass, hidden edges in a thick, ugly blanket. Then I remembered. Zoo. I could see the wreckage clearly now as I limped forward. The pickup truck, which at one point had been parked beside Betty, was now several hundred feet, resting in the empty green field. The smaller silver Volkswagen was on its side. In front of it, a heap of twisted metal, and I barely recognized. It was smoking wildly, belching out thick smoke, as if we were the only one small spark away from exploding. It rammed it, I realized. The truck rammed it out of the way. I followed the trail of tire marks and glass, but I only found truck driver, what was left of him. His body was tangled up in itself in the wild grass. I couldn't tell where one limb began and where the other ended. None of them seemed to be in their right place. His elbows stuck up from the ground like two broken wings. He had been rammed too. Something cold and brittle wrapped itself around my chest, forcing me back out of the haze of smoke. Once I confirmed Zoo wasn't in either car, I waited until I cleared the heaviest of the smoke before falling to my knees and throwing up what little food I had in my stomach. It was only when I looked up that I finally saw her, sitting on the road beside Betty, her back slumped forward, her head bowed, but alive and safe. My mind clung to those two words as I tried calling for her. Zoo looked up, panting. As I stumbled closer, the smoke revealed her in pieces, bloodshot eyes, a cut on her forehead, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheek. My head throbbed in time with my heartbeat as I knelt down in front of her, and for several agonizing seconds, it was all that I could hear. "Okay?" I asked, my mouth feeling like mush. Her teeth chattered as she nodded. "What happened?" Zoo curled down on herself like she was trying to vanish from my sight. Her yellow gloves were beside her on the ground, and her bare hands were still up and facing forward, as if she had only touched the truck a second before. I didn't know what to say to get her to calm down. I didn't even know how to calm myself down. This girl, this Yellow, she destroyed 2 vehicles and 1 life in a matter of seconds. And by the looks of it, she'd done it with a single touch. But even knowing that, she was still Zoo. And those hands, they were the ones that had pulled me to safety. I lifted her back into Betty with shaking arms. Zoo was hot, well past the point of feeling feverish. Dropping her into the closest seat, I pressed my hand against her cheeks, but her eyes couldn't focus on me. I was about to roll the door shut when she grabbed my wrist and pointed toward the gloves on the ground. "Got 'em," I said. I tossed them to her and then turned to confront a heavier load. Chubbs was still passed out in the passenger seat, his body hanging out of the open door. The truck driver hadn't been able to maneuver his long limbs farther than that, thank God. Otherwise, Chubbs probably would have been in the grass with the driver. His limp sack of bones smacked against the door as I slammed it shut behind him. I tripped over the tips of my tennis shoes as I made my way around the front of the van, with a cloud of bright spots bleaching out of my sight. I pulled the driver's door open to rest the rest of the way. Liam was still out cold, and no amount of shaking was able to stir him up into consciousness. Zoo began to whimper, her cries muffled as she pressed her face against her knees. "You're okay, Zoo," I said. "We're all okay. We're gonna be fine." I untangled Liam's arms from the gray seatbelt and half pushed, half rolled him off the driver's seat. I wasn't strong enough to deposit him into one of the back seats, not right then, so he ended up on the ground, wedged between the two front seats, with his face turned towards me. I could see the muscles of his mouth twitch every so often, turning the corners of his lip up in an unnatural smile. I stared at the wheel, trying to bring to mind the right steps to getting the van to work, trying to remember what Liam had done, what Kate had done, what my father used to do. 16, and I couldn't even figure out where the goddamn parking brake was, let alone if it was actually on. In the end, it didn't matter. I could drive with it on or off, apparently, and all I really needed to know was that the right pedal was go and the left was stop. And there really wasn't a whole lot more to it than that. Betty tore through the thickest heart of the smoke and chased it down the open road until we were finally free of the wreckage, and the air coming through the vents no longer carried the echo of the white noise into our heads, or smell of smoke into our lungs. And that is the end of chapter 10. Come back next time, and we're going to be doing chapter 11. I'm going to actually try to upload back to back, so when this video comes out, it will be chapter 10, and then tomorrow will be chapter 11. So I hope you all enjoyed, and again, if you haven't, please hit that thumbs up button. I would greatly appreciate it. Share with your friends, and if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe. And have a good day, everyone, or a good night, good evening, wherever you may be. Ruby out.